Citizens and political observers fear the insurgents have emerged in a stronger position to dictate terms. Former Afghan President Hamid Karzai applauds during talks with the Taliban in Moscow on February 6, 2019. AP Photo Ordinary Afghans and political observers say they fear the talks hosted by Russia last week have harmed the prospects of long-term peace and given the Taliban insurgents the upper hand in negotiations with the United States. The two-day Moscow meeting marked the first time senior Afghan politicians have held direct talks with the hardline Islamist militants, and the resulting joint declaration issued on Wednesday endorsed some of the group's demands such as the complete withdrawal of foreign forces, the release of Taliban prisoners and removal of Taliban leaders from a UN blacklist. In an unlikely photo op afterwards, Taliban members and mainstream politicians including former President Hamid Karzai, former National Security Advisor Hana Fatmar, opposition leader Adam Mohammed Noor and Mohammad Mohaqiq, who was fired as Deputy Chief Executive by President Ashraf Ghani last month, stood side by side and declared the meeting very successful. "It depends on what you see as success," said Hekmatullah Azmi, Deputy Director at Center for Conflict and Peace Studies in Kabul. "If getting the Afghan side to sit with the Taliban, then it was surely a success, but I think we should measure success with how the U.S. views this meeting," he told The National. The Taliban had made military progress in the last year, but with this meeting they have also gained certain political status and legitimacy. Hekmatullah Azmi, Center for Conflict and Peace Studies. Although Washington made no official comment on the talks, neither did it voice opposition. Mr. Azmi noted that the U.S. stance on the involvement of Russia and even Iran in Afghan affairs had changed since Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad took charge of the peace effort in September, holding several rounds of talks with Taliban at their political office in Doha as well as in Abu Dhabi. The U.S. had no objection with the Afghan elites attending this meeting, he said, comparing it to Moscow's attempt to hold a similar meeting last year that was eventually abandoned because Afghan politicians would not attend, fearing U.S. disapproval. However, the lack of direct talks between the Taliban and the government, owing to the group's refusal to negotiate with what it calls a puppet regime, complicates efforts to end the 17-year insurgency. "There appears to be a confrontation of sorts between the various approaches to peace," Mr. Azmi said. While the U.S. is pressuring to the Taliban to talk to the government, Mr. Azmi said the Moscow meeting gave a boost to the insurgents' negotiating position and influence. The Taliban had made military progress in the last year, but with this meeting they have also gained certain political status and legitimacy, in terms of local diplomacy, he said. To see them recognized by the Afghan political elite should worry the government because in some ways it brings the Taliban mainstream. The next time they sit with the U.S., the Taliban can say confidently that the Afghan people don't have a problem with them. This will affect the Afghan government. Mr. Ghani on Sunday made another attempt to engage with the Taliban, renewing an offer to allow them to open an office inside Afghanistan, but this was swiftly rejected by the insurgents. Mr. Azmi said the president had handled the issue of the Moscow talks diplomatically. Ghani didn't show strong opposition because it could have affected the declaration of the meeting, he said, suggesting that the document might have included direct criticism of the government. But they're between a rock and a hard place. A statement by the presidential spokesman dismissed the legitimacy of the meeting and the significance of the ensuing declaration. The Moscow meeting was a political and academic discussion on peace and the declaration was a summary of the two-day summit. It is not an executive outcome on peace, Harun Shan-Kansuri said. Many Afghans also object to the absence of the government at the Moscow talks, largely supporters of Mr. Ghani but some of his critics as well. Many took to social media to register their protest under the hashtag "We shouldn't let the people who ruined our childhood in their war for power ruin our present and future too," Salma Al-Ghozai, a civil servant from Kabul, wrote on Twitter. They have come together to repeat history. The history that we are still struggling to wash off of our identity, suppose my Hamid Karzai, an Afghan student of international trade law, echoed the sentiment. Taliban are not to be trusted, she told The National. If the Taliban truly want peace, our government has an office they can negotiate with. Afghan constitution can also be amended and they can bring all the changes they want, but in a more institutionalized manner. She said the current government had made much progress in peace efforts with the Taliban, including the historic Eid ceasefire last year, increased pressure on the Pakistani government to stop supporting the insurgents, and a peace deal with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of the Hizb-e Islami group. Ms. Karzai said a similar situation involving the Taliban and then-President Mohammad Najibullah in the 1990s should serve as a warning. Once the Taliban made the same promise with Dr. Najibullah, he was willing to negotiate with them, but when they entered the capital, they murdered him. They don't want peace or pardon for the atrocities they committed. They want the fall of the government, and chaos so they can once again take control of the country. A Kabul-based academic, who asked not to be identified, said he was concerned about how politicians had reversed their positions towards the Taliban in Moscow, and the possibility of U.S. forces leaving Afghanistan. Those who went to Moscow are the ones who have been fighting the Taliban on front lines. Former President Hamid Karzai did not provide the Taliban office space during his tenure, but now it's part of the declaration. Hanif Atmar signed the BSA bilateral security agreement with the United States on his second day in the last government, which allowed the U.S. troops to stay and fight the Taliban, but now he is calling for a withdrawal, he said. Mr. Khalilzad said after talks with the Taliban last month that they had agreed on a draft deal that include U.S. forces withdrawing in exchange for a ceasefire, intra-Afghan talks and a guarantee that Afghanistan would not harbor terrorists. But the academic doubted the Taliban would remain peaceful once U.S. troops had left the country. I am worried that they will return the way the communists or the Mujahideen returned, he said. But if the Americans stay, there is a possibility that they might return peacefully. Updated, February 10, 2019, 6:20 p.m.